What's the most horrifying real-life death you've heard about? I was coming home from baseball practice in high school, and when coming down my street I see my neighbor across the street outside in the driveway crying. She was 6, and it was pouring. I asked her what was wrong and all she said was Amy is in the closet. I said what? Her parents weren't home nor were mine. I didn't want to have her explain it, so I asked her to show me. We go in her room, and she is hanging in the closet with a noose around her neck. Blood everywhere from slitting her throat and wrist. I picked her sister up as she was sobbing and held her and called 911. I went to feel her pulse to make sure she didn't have one. I was 16, I had no idea what to do. We sat outside on the porch until the police came. I couldn't get a hold of their parents as I didn't have their phone numbers and the youngest daughter didn't know. The mom and dad came home and it was just awful. The scream the mom made will always haunt me, and obviously that whole scene will haunt me. It isn't as horrific as these stories are, but to me, this was just as bad. Edit, changing the name of the girl out of respect. That's terrible. That was very brave of you for 16. This girl bung jumping to her death in Spain, because she misheard no jump, as now jump. Maybe not the most horrifying, but absolutely terrible and tragic. Whoa, just leave the word jump completely out. Stay back or wait would have worked, or forcing the jumper to not even be at the edge until tethered. Sad failures. Maybe they didn't speak English well. Maybe my expectations are way too high, but if you have to tell someone to not do something that will kill them. Language barriers, especially, you just physically prevent them from doing that. There was an old guy who lived down the road from me. He wasn't good on his feet, so only used the bottom half of his house. He went to go to bed one night but fell in front of his old electric heater next to his bed in the living room and couldn't get up again. The poor bloke was cooked alive. When the paramedics turned up, they had to go into the garden to vomit. It was horrific apparently. I only know this because a couple of family members went to see what was happening when an ambulance turned up at his house. I'm not sure who called it. They said it was truly awful. The guy survived for a while in the hospital with his injuries, but unfortunately passed. He must have been in front of the heater for hours, the poor bastard. My dad watched a girl burn to death in her car. I guess there had been an accident and they couldn't get her out and the car caught on fire. My dad was driving tow truck at the time and they called him to tow the vehicles. When my dad noticed she was still in there, he tried to throw his tow hook through the window and pull her out, but the cops wouldn't let him. See, there's a chance you'll hit her. So they all stood and watched. My dad has only told me this story and it still haunts him. Jesus fuck. On today's episode of Cops Are Goddamn Morons and Unfit to Make Decisions. Yeah, no kidding. That's when the civilian puts the paid buyer taxes protect and serve worker in their place, lets them know they're a horse's ass, and proceeds to do the right thing and try to help. Zero criticism to the dad from the story. But fuck those police. Guy I knew flew himself and his family to Florida from the Midwest for a Christmas Disney trip in his personal plane. He was flying in some lower seated clouds when his engine died. He tried a couple things to restart his engine but couldn't get it to come back. When he came out of the clouds, he was over a forest with no way to glide somewhere to land and had to put it down in the trees and hope. The crash killed himself, his wife, and 2 of his 3 kids, except for his youngest daughter who walked 2 miles barefoot in the late December snow to find help. But she survived. The horrific part of it to me though is that this guy's plane has 2 separate fuel tanks, one in the left wing, and one in the right wing. The reason the engine died was because it was fuel starved. The pilot had been flying on a single tank for the entire flight up until that point, but had another wing filled to the brim with fuel. He could have saved his family's lives as well as his own, and prevented his daughter's trauma if he would have just made sure to follow the checklist that pilots of that airframe practice religiously every day that they go fly. Personal plane crashes almost always seem to be fuel-related and preventable. Familiarity leads to complacency, which leads to mistakes, and a mistake a few thousand feet in the air is typically going to be fatal. Dale Snodgrass, arguably the greatest F-14 Tomcat pilot who ever lived, died from a plane crash he piloted himself because he neglected to check the checklist and forgot to remove the flight control lock before the flight. Back in the mid-70s, my mother worked at one of the many sewing factories in the U.S. South. They had gone on break around 10 a.m. and noticed the lineman up there working on the pole. They came out for lunch at noon and he was still up there, but not moving. He had grabbed a live wire and it fried him in place. Had to break his arms to get him down. He was also the father of one of my school buddies. My stepbrother was a lineman. He hit a live wire by accident one day, and by the time they got him to the hospital, one arm and both legs had to be amputated because of the damage. He passed away still in the hospital within a month of the accident. My oldest brother was electrocuted by the same kind of wires along with 5 other men while moving a metal event tent for the company they worked for. 4 of them, including my brother, passed away in the hospital and 2 of them managed to survive somehow. I don't remember all the details because it happened almost 20 years ago now. RIP to both of them and your schoolmate's dad. I am so sorry for your losses. After Pearl Harbor got attacked, they raised the hulk of one of the sunken battleships and found one of the compartments had a calendar scratched onto the wall indicating someone had survived in the partially flooded room for like 2 weeks. Pretty sure that was the Oklahoma. That's not even the worst of it. Rescue workers could hear the tapping from dudes banging on the sides of the battleship with wrenches signaling for help. The ship capsized and trapped pockets of air that those guys were breathing. When rescuers tried to cut into the hull and get them out, they let out the air and it was replaced with the water from below, but the holes in the hull were too small to get out the men. That cave diver who got stuck upside down in a cramped dead end and couldn't be physically pulled back out. Even worse, he was almost pulled free and the pulley system came out of the cave wall and he got wedged deeper. At that point he was screwed. That's the worst part of this story. Really? I think the most horrifying thing is they never got him out. They wouldn't have been able without shredding the corpse in the process. So they just left him in there and filled the cave with concrete. In Victoria, Australia, some freeways have these speed wires which are like 3 cables strung along a fence instead of your standard solid barrier. First time I drove to uni, it was raining and a motorcyclist fell off in front of me, hitting these cables and literally exploded. His head flew about 50 meters before it splattered on the road. Pretty fucked thing for a 19-year-old to see. We call them cheese graters for motorcyclists here. An old teacher of mine had a brother die in one of those accidents. Seems odd that someone would call it a cheese grater tbh. It sounds like they're set up like those weird wire presses to slice boiled eggs. People being walled up inside of a brick column or wall. I believe the punishment is called immurement. Last one I heard of was a serial killer in the 1800s. They walled him inside the corner of a building. People said they could hear him screaming for mercy for a week before he fell silent. Imagine, inside a cold, damp, pitch black chamber, too cramped to stand up or sit down. Most likely was crawling with bugs. No food, no water, no mercy. I imagine he went mad before the second day was up because he knew death was the only escape. So I read the Wikipedia over immurement and found this. In a 1984 episode of Thomas the Tank Engine, the sad story of Henry 59, the engine Henry was immured as punishment for being recalcitrant. Because he didn't want to leave his tunnel in the rain. He was afraid to mess up his new paint job, so they walled him in the tunnel up to his eyes. He could see the other trains roll by as they chastised him. It was fucked up, man. While Gordon laughs and tells Henry it serves him right. Because Henry's fire has gone out. He has no steam to respond. Dirt and soot from the tunnel's roof has already ruined his paint anyway. Now that Henry is sad, lonely and cold, he wonders if he will ever be let out to pull trains again. WTF. A truckload of hot asphalt for resurfacing roads was accidentally dumped on a teenager in my province. He would have died instantly, but other people on the crew still got severe burns trying to dig him out. 30 years ago in Toronto, a Greyhound bus flipped on the Gardner Expressway. The bus dumped 90 degrees to the right. Passengers were impaled by the filthy salt-encrusted guardrail. A similar story only happened a month or 2 ago in Australia. A wedding party was on a bus that rolled onto its side, decapitating some apparently, killing a total of 10, I believe. Did I hear about that in a vineyard region? I immediately thought DUI. My neighbor tied a noose around his neck and the other end to a metal handrail, got in his car, and floored it, tore his head clean off. That's fucking brutal. I hope you weren't the one to find him. Oh God, no, thankfully. Was morbidly curious enough to check out the chalk drawings the police left after they'd cleaned up though. Funnily enough, they didn't draw a chalk outline of his head, just a box with an arrow showing the direction it rolled in. I didn't even know they still did chalk drawings of bodies anymore. How horrific to have to see that every time you walk by until it rains or gets washed off. I think that dude that was just eaten by that tiger shark in Egypt was pretty gnarly. Dad watching, eaten chunk by chunk, at one time being completely flipped upside down and pulled under. The blood bubbles. Brutal. Wasn't there a 2-year-old in Florida who was eaten by an alligator a few years ago, before COVID? If anyone even remembers such a life. His family were there, but I'm not sure how graphic the actual death was. Are you thinking of the Disney park one? They were at Disney. Kid was at the edge of the water, scooping water to use for a sand castle. Alligator grabbed him. The dad jumped in and tried to free the kid, but was unsuccessful and it got free and dived. The dad had injuries from the alligator's teeth where he tried to pry open its mouth. Absolutely horrific. I think about this constantly. My mind goes to them having to fly back home without him. The guy who was boiled alive in a Yellowstone spring while his sister was recording it surely comes to mind. Unfortunately, people sometimes also did such things to other people on purpose, not just in deep history. The government of Uzbekistan is suspected to have boiled people in the 2000s. I recall a story of a man who saw his loose dog run into the spring and he without hesitation dove in after the dog. The dog didn't last long, but the guy miraculously managed to be saved. His eye cooked like hard-boiled eggs. He was saved but didn't live long. He was blind. His skin basically slid off and his nerves were so cooked he felt numb. Not only are those pools insanely hot but also very acidic as well. There's actually a few that are basic alkaline. Instead, in the same area. Even, I can't imagine which one would be worse to fall into. Either boiling acid, or boiling natural bleach. Lot of people died in those pools. Read about it in Death in Yellowstone. Fascinating read. A lot of the hot spring deaths were accidental and just dumb. With that, some of the ones in the book about beer-related deaths were way worse. Because I can kinda get people being dumb and not realizing just how hot, and acidic alkaline, those pools actually are. Despite the signs and stuff. It's the shit like people going up to goddamned wild grizzlies and acting like they're tame dogs or something boggles my fucking mind. It's a goddamn wild bear. I mean, shit. I've always been kinda cautious while walking some of the trails here in Allegheny State Park. And all we have are the little black bears, which are generally skittish around people. And yet, so many people would just walk right up to wild grizzlies and expect it to go well. Same with the bison. Like, I'm not gonna fault the people who accidentally came too close to wild bison in the park. Like when they turned a blind corner on a trail and suddenly, bam, pissed off bison right there. Those cases are just bad luck. Nobody did anything deliberately wrong. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The people going up to them, thinking they're tame and like cows. Though, my God, why? My cousin walked under a grain auger and the hood of his hoodie got caught in it. He was sucked up into it and decapitated before it could be shut off. My grandpa had to clean his head out of the auger. My heart started breaking for your cousin and then broke right in half for your poor grandfather having to deal with the aftermath. Junko Furuta. Ugh, so sad. The monsters who raped, tortured, and murdered her are now free citizens of Japan. What the actual fuck? Came here looking for this. Reading her wiki page made me scared of being alive for a couple of weeks. The most terrifying thing I've ever seen on the internet. One thing they don't show, in most places, when they show 911 footage is people jumping. They don't show it because some people recognize jumpers on live television. Imagine how horrible things must have been. To have to make a decision between dying instantly in about 10 seconds, and possibly taking people out on the ground. That's how the fire chaplain died. And painfully in, say, 10 minutes. If was in the situation that the 911 jumpers were, people on the ground wouldn't even be on my mind. Hot, dark, thick, choking. Toxic smoke is pushing you out of building to stand on a window ledge, and you get to choose between the acrid smoke and jumping. I'd jump. There's barely a choice. Your basic instincts are for clean air and to stay away from being burned alive. I remember watching a documentary about it and what one of the firemen said. I just remember looking up, thinking how bad is it up there that the better option is to jump? I had a friend who was engaged to an underwater electrician or welder. I mean, this man would go down so far it was completely black. Long story short, he went down one day, and never came back up. I don't remember if something ruptured or if he was shocked to death, but I remember thinking how awful it must have been to have died in such an abysmal place. I think I've read that job is one of, if not the most dangerous job in the world. It pays extremely well, but many do not survive. I assumed this was an exaggeration. Nope. While the work can be very profitable, it can be argued that it's the most dangerous job in the country. In fact, underwater welders have the highest fatality rate of any occupation, 15%. 15% fatality rate is fucking bananas. Imagine your current workplace and knowing 15% of you will eventually die working there. 20 years ago on the TTC, a guy with a knapsack was late to get up and out the door at his subway stop. He got onto the platform, but the doors closed on his backpack. The train continued to drag him down the platform, before slamming into the wall by the tunnel. The news made a point of saying that he drug tested positive for weed. Like he brought it on himself. Could have been me. Oh boy, I pulled open the train doors on Atlanta International Airport subtrain for a guy that got his backpack stuck like this just last year. It probably wouldn't have ended in the same way, but we might have been stuck on the train a while if he managed to get his pack stuck between the train and the tunnel wall. Why the fuck isn't there a law in the U.S. to ensure they have sensors in those doors? I am 37 and even since I was a little kid, I've never seen an automatic door that just closes on things or people. The sensors are placed at intervals which happen to not be at the height of his backpack. The door also stops if it senses an obstruction before it closes fully. But the backpack straps could allow it to close fully between his back and the backpack. I spent a career as fireman in a big city. About 15 years ago we responded to a middle-of-the-night fire in the basement of an old, triple brick, 2-story single-family, balloon frame residence. On this particular weekend, the 9-year-old daughter was having a sleepover. 8 kids and the parents either got out or were pulled out by responders. But we couldn't find the daughter. All efforts on scene were directed to rescue operations, so the fire quickly advanced as firefighters searched throughout the pitch black, hot as fuck structure. My partner and I were searching the second floor, working solely on feel, and we could hear her screaming for help. "Okay, we hear you. We're coming. We got this." My partner and I were experienced. We'd made other rescues. We were professionals in our craft. But the second floor layout didn't make any sense. Doors that could be felt, but were sealed shut, rooms longer than you would have expected, etc. We learned later that the entire second floor has been remodeled, leaving some of the original design pieces in place, but extending rooms and modifying entrances. It was the hottest fire I've ever been in. With everyone, rightly, focused on more than a half-dozen rescues, the fire was left unchecked and the thing was just ripping, running vertically through the pipe chases. Eventually, we didn't hear her screaming anymore. We stayed up on that floor well past when the chief wanted us out, throwing our shoulders into faux doors, trying to breach walls into the bathroom, etc. Until finally we were out of air. We were outside telling another crew where our search left off when the roof collapsed into the second floor. It was hours before we could recover her body. Over a career of fire and EMS I've seen my share of terrible, tragic shit. You empathize, but you disassociate to a degree. You have to. If you didn't, you'd work one shift and never come back. So I learned not to carry too much horrific stuff with me. We did our best at everything we were called to. Sometimes it worked out. Sometimes it didn't. That has to be enough in this line of work. But that little girl screaming is one of the 57 calls that I still think about and can still hear. We did what we could and we did a lot of good that night, but we failed her. You didn't fail her. You almost were an additional casualty. You did literally everything you could short of dying yourself. There's nothing that could have saved her. That's just the sad truth. I will say, you're a prime example of the type of human that we should all attempt to emulate. A truly heroic individual. The woman in China who got stuck in an elevator on a holiday weekend. When they eventually found her, there were scratch marks on the door and her hands were bloody from trying to get out. It was a month. There's a diff story about a woman who got eaten by an escalator. Her legs fell through the panel at the top of the escalator, and she threw her child at the 2 mall employees waiting there. They knew something was wrong with the panel, but didn't know how to stop the escalator. I haven't seen any pictures of the aftermath, but I assume she was turned into hamburger. I knew a guy, friend's older brother, who jumped off a 90-foot cliff in Montana and landed on the rocks, at a popular river hangout. He died instantly and about 50 people witnessed it, including a bunch of my friends. I'm glad I was working that day, otherwise I definitely would have been there. Instantly is kind of a blessing. Friend of a friend fell out of a hunting blind and was paralyzed from the neck down. His face was in a fire ant hill, covered in thousands of bites, and he was dead when they found him. Holy fuck, that's horrifying. This was a workplace accident a few years ago that killed a union brother of mine. He came into work early to make up for some time he had taken off. He was using a forklift to dump trash. He hopped off it to do something in front of the lift. The lift was still in gear and slowly crept forward and pinned him in between the dumpster and the lift. If he hadn't come in early, there would have been a ton of other people around and he probably would have been fucked up but alive. The contractor I currently work for won't let anyone work a shift alone. And we don't just leave when the day is over. We all meet up, make sure everyone is accounted for, then go home. I know it's not the most fucked up death on here, but it really hit home for a lot of guys. I didn't know him, but a lot of people did. There is only about 1,500 people in my union, so when one person dies a lot of people feel it. Like they say, regulations are written in blood. Race car driver Russ Phillips was killed when his car hit a catch fence roof first, and his upper body was dragged along the fence, leaving pieces of his face, brain and torso all along the fencing. He was decapitated and shredded in half. Damn, on his first pole position race too. Fucking wild that they started back up after only 40 minutes. They started back up? Yep, the track president called it a freak deal and started back up after a 40-minute red flag, after one of the most brutal deaths in motorsport. The guy who got slowly cooked alive inside a tunican oven. The other guy who was pushed into a manhole and steamed for like an hour. And the Russian woman who was eaten alive by bears while she talked about it with her mom over the phone. Also any number of cave diving stories. The most terrifying one I have a personal connection to was a man my father knew who was slowly sucked into an industrial fan. Truly terrifying stuff, and RIP to all those who suffered them. I hope their families somehow found peace. I got obsessed with that Russian woman eaten by a bear, and I have great news. I'm 99% sure it isn't real. It only appears in weird tabloids that will print anything. All articles on it seem to reference the Daily Mail UK reporting on it, which isn't a reliable source. This Wikipedia page has an editor's reasoning that it's fake. Basically there's no reliable sources for it, and it doesn't appear in any Russian publications even though it was supposedly a Russian woman. Thanks. I hope that you're right because it's a horrifying story. Some of the worst have been mentioned already, so I'll go ahead and mention the Thunder River Rapids ride accident of 2016. Incredibly public and incredibly gruesome. Edit. The wiki page link provides an overview, but isn't too graphic. I don't think anyone needs to go find the incredibly graphic details. Normally a paramedic doctor needs to officially call a death, but apparently, according to the paper news etc., that wasn't required in the Dreamworld incident as the injuries were incompatible with life. That always disturbed me. That is probably the most grim expression you'll ever read in relation to an accident. Usually translates as head is no longer in the same vicinity as the body. Years ago, my grandfather was on a search and rescue team of a train crash. For a reason I can't recall, he wasn't allowed to report anyone as dead. He was there just to help find folks and get them help. He told me that he spoke with someone. I found a body. We'll need someone to come and clean up, to which they replied, you don't have the authority, or something to that effect, where he cut them off. His body is about 24 yards that way, and his head is another 3 past that, and went to go help someone else. I'm missing a lot of details, partially because he's no longer around to tell the story, and partially because he didn't like telling it. This is horrifying. Wow. When I did advanced first aid training, we were told it was far beyond our scope of practice to declare anyone dead unless it was something very obvious like a decapitation. Maybe it was a policy like that? It's mass incident triage. It's usually a color code, and the survivability is assessed in order to sort people for first aid, essentially separating walking wounded. If you're not showing certain traits of physical medical activity, you're left where you are. A decapitation is basically the same as not breathing. It's not a frequent model that is used, at least where I live, and I hope like hell I never have to. I'm merely commenting within context of a situation like a train crash.